Okay, so welcome, and we're here. It's a meetup from Michigan Technology Services, and our guest tonight, all the way from Golden, Colorado.
Yeah.
Via Zoom. Karen, I'll let you introduce yourself in a few minutes, but most of you guys know me. Some don't. I'm Rob Kalman. I own an agile training and coaching org in Metro Detroit in Farmington Hills. You can see I'm home right now. A lot of leadership training, Scrum, and product training. And occasionally we like to host free meetups. So people who've taken our workshops, people we've coached, have an ability to just, interact with everybody, ask them questions, and learn something a little outside of a traditional classroom. And you can earn an SEU, some continuing education as well. You guys have questions? We're gonna keep it pretty free flowing. Karen, I don't know, do you want questions throughout? You want to keep it to the end for the last 30 minutes? How do you?
Well, I call on people as we go through stuff, just because you can help me with this. And if you have a burning question, we can bring it up, but we can do stuff at the end. So I'm
That's fine. I just want to get a general flow for people. You can use the chat function if you don't like talking on camera, or email, text me directly, and we'll go from there. But thanks for joining, guys. I'll be in the background. Karen, it's all yours. Thank you for joining us for the psychological safety meetup.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rob. Since we're thanking everybody, This is a lot of effort and energy, and so appreciate you organizing and coordinating this. So that's awesome. Appreciate it. I'm pretty passionate about the topics, so I'm happy to share. And so thanks for all being here. My guess is most of you are in the Eastern time zone, so it's 5 o'clock. And for me, it's just 3 o'clock. So I joked with Rob, I said, so we could be having beers, but I can't have a beer while I'm doing this because I'll get a little distracted, but you can, or whatever, a coffee, a water, whatever works. It's not about beer. So anyway, I wanted to say thank you, Rob, for that. So I'm going to share, I have a slide deck that we're going to go through, and it's based on a workshop that I run. So this is kind of the high level view of it. And actually, Rob is part of that too. If you're interested in a deep dive after the fact, you can certainly inquire with him or sign up for the class. But that's not what this is about. I'm not trying to get you to sign up for the class. I'm just sharing with you where this comes from and kind of how it works. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. And you all can help me a little bit. Can you see it? Can you see the screen if you give me a thumbs up? Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to dig into this topic of psychological safety, but real quick, like, who am I? And why am I even qualified to talk about this? So my background is really, I've been in the corporate world for 35 plus years. And over the last 5 years of that, I have really gotten into executive coaching and teaching psychological safety. But prior to that, my original craft was I'm an engineer, so a software developer and electrical engineer. And then over the years, I ended up with a doctorate degree in organizational development. And so I went from a coder and a programmer with Hewlett Packard to, when I finally left the corporate world, running a financial technology company as a president in downtown Denver. So over that span of time, I've gained a lot of experience of things, and in some cases, like what not to do. And so this workshop actually really has been something, they always say you teach best what you most need to learn. So I think that maybe that's part of it for me. But the doctor in me is going to make me give credit to the folks that I have had the good fortune of either working with, taking their workshops, becoming certified with. So I'll tell you a little bit about the background for this workshop and for this slide deck, and then we'll dig into it. So first person is Timothy Clark, and he's an Oxford PhD, runs a company called Leader Factor. He is the guy that has this book called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. It's a pretty thin little book, so it's worth reading. You can actually go out to his website too and download the ebook, kind of the cliff notes of that. But he has the framework, the 4 stages that that I use in the workshop and that we'll talk about today. And the next person on here is Brene Brown. Many of you maybe know her. She studies vulnerability and shame. She's based out of the University of Texas, and she's a clinical social worker. She's pretty popular. She actually has a Netflix show now even, so it's pretty amazing. But she brings in quite a bit to this because of her work on vulnerability. The next person is Amy Edmondson, yet another PhD from Harvard. And she writes the book, or has written the book called The Fearless Organization. So this is another one that's, in, of course, my opinion, worth reading. She does a ton of research on how psychological safety has affected teams, and in a lot of cases in like high risk, high pressure situations. So for example, hospitals, NICUs, operating rooms. So she does a bunch of research associated to that. Fascinating book, and she's been great as far as I've actually got to meet her, which is pretty cool. The last person on here's name is David Rock. He's a neuroscientist, and he runs an organization called the Neuro Leadership Institute. And he has a number of books too, but we bring him in because of his work on the brain and how the brain responds under threat. And that has a big part, a big component to psychological safety. So thanks to them, I want to give them credit just so you all know. And then based on that, what are we going to do today? So we're going to talk a little bit about what is psychological safety from a definition standpoint. Why does it matter? And then how do you create it? So we'll spend most of our time focused on like a couple of things in each of the 4 stages, from learner to inclusion to learning to contributing to challenging the status quo. In each of those stages, maybe 1 or 2 little things that you can try. So get a piece of paper, if you would, and maybe a pen or pencil or whatever works for you. And as we go through this, like think about like, hey, how might I try that? Or would that something work for me in my work, in my life, in my home, maybe in my church, wherever you have teams and groups of people where you are starting to engage. So hopefully you'll get something out of this, right? So this hour and a half spent together is something where you could say, oh, cool, I learned something new and I'm going to experiment. So, okay, and then we'll end with some Q&A. All right, so first things first. So we're going to use the chat for this because it's easier and there's 45 people here. But when you hear the term psychological safety, I'm curious, what do you think that is? Like, what comes up for you? What have you heard, or what do you think that what's psychological safety? So just spend a couple minutes and put it in chat. Okay. Freedom to speak up, ability to be yourself. I'm just going to kind of read these. An environment where you feel safe and empowered to say anything. Comfortable. True voice, safe conversations, those are cool. Contrary opinions, that's a good one. Comfortable to be yourself. Safe to fail, these are great. They're right on the money. Freedom to express your thoughts and opinions. Okay, so we're on the same sort of thread. All of the things coming in seem like they have a common kind of thread. For us, I'm going to leverage simple definition. It's only 5 words, and it comes from Tim Clark, which is an environment of rewarded vulnerability. So that's our definition. So then, I don't know about you, but then my next question is like, okay, so what is vulnerability? What does that mean? So I have the same question to you all. So put in chat, like, what do you think that is? Like, what comes up for you when you think of the word vulnerability? I can tell you for me, while you're doing that, like I think of it as I'm afraid, fear a little bit. I live in Colorado. We have all these meadows. I think of like a deer in a meadow by itself, and kind of on the perimeter, there's like maybe a mountain lions, and it's like, woo, I'm afraid. Like I can feel for that deer, like there's some vulnerability there. So these are, oh, Brene Brown, open to risk. Yeah. Sharing your failures. Okay. So speaking of Brene Brown, so that's a good one. Let's build on this. I have a video here from her, since she's our expert on vulnerability and shame. We're going to watch this video. It's like 6 minutes. And so while you're watching it, take some notes. Like, what does she say about the definition of vulnerability? Since our definition of psychological safety is an environment of rewarded vulnerability, we're going to dig into what's vulnerability. And give me a thumbs up that you can hear it. Oh, sorry.
We think about vulnerability as a dark emotion. You know, there are a lot of people who talk about positive emotions, negative emotions, dark emotions, light emotions. We think of vulnerability as a dark emotion. We think of it as the core of fear and shame and grief and disappointment, uncertainty, things that we do not want to feel, right? Things that I don't want to be vulnerable because that means I'm afraid. That means I'm uncertain. That means I'm at risk. I'm exposed. I'm in grief. So what we do is we armor up and we say, I do not want to slip into these dark emotions. I will not let myself be vulnerable. But here's what I learned from the research, and certainly put into motion in my own life, that was the most life-changing, is that vulnerability is the center of difficult emotion. But it's also the birthplace of every positive emotion that we need in our lives. Love, belonging, joy, empathy. How many of you would agree that we're in a serious empathy deficit in our culture today? Totally, right? No vulnerability, no empathy. In a culture where people are afraid to be vulnerable, you can't have empathy. You know, empathy is not a default response. If you share something with me that's difficult, in order for me to be truly empathic, I have to step into what you're feeling. And that's vulnerable. So there can be no empathy without vulnerability. Why do you think, in that example that I used a while ago, daughter comes home and says, you know, tears, no one sat with me at lunch today. They made fun of what I was wearing. So-and-so won't talk to me. They poured my books out of my locker. And the response back is, I told you, I bought you all those cute jeans. Why aren't you wearing those jeans? And pull your hair back. Is that an empathic response? No, it's a shaming response. Could that shaming response be at that? Could a mother who absolutely adores her child respond with that shaming response? Please say yes. Don't kid yourself. I mean, come on. If you're a parent sitting in here, then you sure as hell know the answer to that is yes. But why? Why did that happen? Where was the access to vulnerability? Where was empathy? You can't access empathy if you're not willing to be vulnerable. So if my daughter comes home and tells that to me, guess what I have to do? I have to reactivate that sweaty palmed 7th grader who lives inside me. And I have to go, oh God, that's so hard. I'm so sorry. That's happened to me. That's happened to me when I was in middle school, and it's happened to me last week. Let's talk about it. But you can't get there without vulnerability. You can't fake empathy. Innovation and creativity, born of vulnerability. To this is my favorite part. I talked about this I did another TED Talk this year in Long Beach. And I told the story that during 2011 and even this year, after the big TEDx Houston talk went viral, the big calls came from Fortune 500 companies. Oh my God, we loved your TED Talk. It was great. Please come talk to all of our senior leaders. And it's like, okay, what do you want to talk about? Like, we don't care. Just come and talk to us. Just if you could ixnay the shame and vulnerability talk. Every single conversation, barring maybe 10%. I was like, well, what do you mean? Well, we love, you're funny. You have this great research. I think there's a real fit with what we do. We don't really do, that kind of stuff around here. So if you could not mention vulnerability and shame. So just for fun, for grins, I would say, okay, so what would you like me to talk about? Yeah, fourth quarter earnings, like freaking don't even balance my checkbook. Like, I'm not going to talk about that. So what do you want me to talk about? Well, the big issue, creativity and innovation. And change. We're going through a lot of change. Like, okay, so vulnerability is the birthplace of creativity, innovation, change. And the reason that crisis is happening is because you're not talking about vulnerability. Imagine creativity and innovation without vulnerability. I'm asking you for a work product that has never been made before, that's completely innovative. I need you to be creative, and I need you to present it to a group of people who are half of them are gonna think it's stupid and not understand it. No vulnerability there.
Okay, I love her. So she talks about it's a dark emotion, right? This concept, and it's my thoughts of like, okay, that deer in the meadow sort of thing. But like, vulnerability is the core to love, belonging, joy, and empathy. And I don't know about you, but like every time I watch that, I think, yeah, I want that. I want that. I also know that as a business person, every company I work with, and probably all of you, like all of us are striving to be more innovative and creative, right? So these are key things. So that vulnerability, if we marry her definition with Tim's definition of psychological safety, we're saying psychological safety is basically this environment where vulnerability, where I can show up, I can feel love, belong, and joy, and it's rewarded. And as a result of that, a lot of you put this in chat too, then I'm going to feel safe to be able to challenge the status quo, to learn, to grow, incorporate other people, and it feels rewarded. So that's what we're talking about today. That's our first sort of learning objective, is what's our definition. And before I get further into like more of why, this little flow chart is another thing that maybe for your notes and so forth, it's pretty important, because us as humans are these kind of living, breathing, sensitive beings, right? And we're constantly evaluating, even if we're doing it unconsciously, subconsciously, under the hood, am I safe or am I not safe? And this idea of, if I'm not safe, if I feel triggered, I'm in that red zone. So I'm kind of in that fight, flight, or freeze zone. And when I'm in that space, I go back into basically personal protection mode, like loss preservation mode. So just a quick example, we do this all the time. So let's just pretend you walk into a restaurant, right? And you can feel it when you walk in. If I walk in and somebody says, oh, it's Karen again, we love seeing her, like, here's your seat, or here's your thing, and whatever, and I feel welcomed, and I feel included, I feel safe. I sort of like that, right? If I walk in and people ignore me, or someone comes up and says, hey, we're super busy, like, we'll get to you when we can, and they're a little bit rude, and I can tell that like the staff is a little bit on each other, like, I don't even know if I want to stay there. Right? I get that sense. I'm like, this doesn't feel great. Like, I'm not going to have a great experience here. So I'm into that sort of like defensive red zone mode. And this happens, like, again, this is something, think about this in work, as you go through from today on out, like, when are you constantly kind of like, is this safe or not safe? Do I feel like I can be me? Or am I going to get punished for showing up in a way that maybe is not part of the norm or conforming? And I tell you the picture about this is a tiger versus a mountain lion, but we're not getting chased by tigers anymore, but like our brains are still responding in that way, fight, flight, or freeze. And if we feel vulnerable and we feel like it's not a safe environment, we've sort of flipped our executive process. The front part of our brain goes offline because the old part, the amygdala, which has all of our emotions, is now controlling. And as a result of that, like we're not going to come up with any new ideas or creative ideas. Somebody's actually drawing on my screen, which is interesting. No one's ever done that before, but I'll just keep moving. So I don't know how you did that even. So let's just do a quick experiment real quick. And this comes from some research by another PhD. Her name is Christine Porath. And she has a book called The Cost of Bad Behavior. And she also wrote an article not that long ago for Harvard Business Review called The Price of Incivility. But I just want to do an experiment with you. And so these are examples of feeling excluded, feeling in that red zone. And I'm going to read them. And what I'd like you to do is in chat, if you can say, I've had that experience and I can feel it, just type in chat, like if I read the first one, just type 1, yes. And if I read the second one and you say, yeah, I can feel that too, you can do all 5 of these. We just want to get a sense for like, how much of this have you felt? When have you had this experience? Does that make sense? So I'll just read them. And as I read them, type into chat like 1, yes, 2, yes, that kind of thing. So the first one is, have you ever felt excluded in a social setting? Have you ever been afraid to ask a question? Have you ever remained silent when you knew the answer to a problem? Have you ever had someone steal credit for something that you did? And have you ever been ignored in a discussion? Okay, so if I look at our chat, yeah, like it's cycling. Like I got a lot, there's like 48 responses. So people can relate, people can feel this. So every one of us, for sure. Usually when I do this in the workshop, we do this with a thing called Menti, and we have these little bars, or we have everybody have their camera on, and as they say that they can feel it or they've had that experience, they turn their camera off. It's kind of a weird feeling when everybody's camera's off. I feel disconnected a little bit. But the point is every one of us in one time in our life, if not more than recently, have been excluded. And there's 12 of them that she goes through, and she does this with a study with 14,000 people. So the result of that, here's the cost. And I'm just highlighting the ones that are above 50%. But when you feel like you're in that red zone, like, hey, I'm unsafe, like I'm not in an environment of rewarded vulnerability, I'm in the red zone, I'm in that zone of like fight, flight, and freeze. When that happens, 80% of the time, we lose work worrying about the incident, like lost time avoiding the offenders. I know I've done that where I'm like, oh, I don't want to see her, I don't want to see him, or I'm uncomfortable. They said our performance declined. And then the last one on here, which is really impactful from a business standpoint, is that their commitment to the organization declined. So this is powerful, right? So we're building the stage here to say environments that are not safe, that are not rewarded for being vulnerable, and people that are like have been gone through these like red zone spaces, this truly impacts our business. So there's 2 big things to answer our second question. Why does this matter? Social stuff going on in the United States, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness is a huge thing, especially since the death of the murder of George Floyd. And so people want to be included. People want to feel what Brene Brown said of, I want to feel love, I want to belong, I want to feel valued, I want to have empathy. And on the other side of it, just like she said, is as a result, like every company wants innovation and creativity. So psychologically safe environments bring this to the forefront for teams, for organizations. So I might argue this is probably the most important leadership competency in 2023 and beyond. So that's huge. So if we believe those two things, an environment of rewarded vulnerability, and we do it because it certainly is the right thing from a social and emotional standpoint, and it enables and empowers innovation and creativity, the question is, how do we do it? So I want to go into Tim's model from here on out. But before we go through each of the stages, inclusion, learning, contributing, and challenging, I want to explain the model a little bit. So we have this X and this Y axis. So the X axis, if we go all the way to the right, and it says permission, and I'm going to use Rob and me as an example on this one. So let's pretend that I work for Rob. And Rob gives me a lot of autonomy and a huge leash, right? And he also gives me a ton of work, but he doesn't really know where I live, what I do, what my hobbies are, if I'm married, if I have kids, whatever. He doesn't care. That's not his thing. His main thing is just crank the work out. Okay. I don't care if you work after hours, on weekends, or on the holidays. That's not his thing. Ultimately, he's kind of in this exploitation mode, right? So very low respect, lots of permission. So we want to stay out of that zone. So if you go the other direction, and we'll keep me and Rob in this space, he has a ton of respect for me. We are buddies. He knows everything about my mother, and she's 90 and this and that, and he knows my dog and loves all of that, right? But doesn't give me a lot of opportunity to grow and learn. And I'd almost say like the helicopter parent, right? Where you kind of are like, yeah, I don't really want you to do new things or do stuff because maybe he's uncomfortable with that, but he likes me as a person. So we want to stay away from the X. Thanks, Rob, for being a good sport. An X and the Y axis. And we want to go up the middle, right? And so the little saying here in the left-hand corner says, as we're giving increasing levels of respect and permission, we feel safe to learn, to contribute, and challenge the status quo as full members of the team and the organization. So this is key. So we want to grow and learn as we move up this model. Okay, does that make sense? Yes, people getting that a little bit? Okay. So let's get into how do we do this. So from here on out, we're going to dig into the 4 stages. We're going to talk a little bit about inclusion, learner safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety. And this is where I'm going to ask for some help. So I'm not the only person always talking. I'm curious if I can get somebody to read this, and I can see your name. So if it's okay, I'm probably just going to call on one of you. So David Garcia. Hi. Would you be willing to read the definition of inclusion safety for us?
Sure.
Awesome.
Inclusion safety is the basic human need to be included, accepted, and belong. You are accepted for who you are, including your unique attributes and defining characteristics.
Awesome. Thank you. And so we just said through that little experiment that was Christine Porath's, and where we typed in the chat, all of us have felt excluded. So all of us have been on that rung of I'm below inclusion. So the thing of it is with this kind of rejection, it's worse in a lot of cases than physical pain, right? If I broke my leg, I could get a cast. I can do rest, ice, elevation, all of those things, and you can see it, and you could maybe even help me. If we feel rejected, if we feel excluded, if we feel that we're not welcome within an organization or within a team, that is really, really hard on us as humans. Some studies have been done where the worst thing you can do to a human being from a punishment standpoint is to put them in prison in a concrete cell and never let them see other people. That we are pack animals, and when we exclude people, that's very, very difficult and very painful. worse than being bullied, worse. In fact, there's another study, kids in high school in the United States, every 26 seconds, someone drops out of high school. That's 7,000 people a day. And why is that? Because they're ignored and they're excluded. Not because they're bullied, not because they're treated poorly. None of that's great either. But more than all of that, it's because they get ignored. So they quit. So this is a big deal. So including somebody shouldn't be because it's a human right, right? You shouldn't have to earn it. As long as we're not hurting somebody else, like it's our right, it's our way to be included. So why do we exclude people? And sometimes we do it unconsciously. So there's a couple things. So we have bias and stereotypes. I was born in the Midwest. I was born in South Dakota. There's not a lot of people that live there. Most people are white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. And there are things I learned as a little girl, like little girls do this, little boys do that. And as an adult now I can challenge that. But I grew up with these norms and stereotypes, everything from social to physical to ethnics to gender, political in the United States, right? We have the Democrat and the Republican parties. There's a whole host of things that get in the way that we've learned. And part of that relates to this concept of this thing called the SEEDS model, which is an acronym from David Rock. And that stands for, we like things that are like us. We have a tendency to like similar things. Expedience, our brain is this massive problem-solving machine. And so it connects things quickly and it says, I know what that is. So we make snap judgments sometimes. Experience is another one, which is my experience is true, right? So I've done that, so I'm pretty sure that I'm right. So my experience, your experience would be different, right? But sometimes we show up and we're like aggressive and hard about this is the way it is because I know. The other one is distance. Like it's easier to like things closer to us than further away. So for example, from a global standpoint, it's easier to look at the media and the news and think, oh, so people in that geography treat, make it up, women incorrectly based on my norms and my stereotypes. That may or may not be right, but I have this mental model of like, hey, it's easier for me to feel safe with people closer to me than further away. And then the last one is about safety. And safety is we as a species have a tendency to prefer things that are safer than things that are riskier, if you will. So we'll tend to like avoid risk to preserve the status quo. So those are reasons why we do this. It doesn't make us bad, it makes us human. So what do we do about it? First thing is question that. So if you think a little bit about some of those things, and I'll give you this slide deck so you can think about it, but maybe you're writing some stuff down as we're going through it. What might be your stereotypes and bias? And how can you examine those? And then this concept of bonding and bridging. So bonding is an opportunity, if you're talking to somebody new, to find out about them. And as you find out, you might find out, hey, we have something in common. I'm a guitar player and a guitar builder, and you might like that too. And that might be an opportunity for us to bond over that, which gives us a connection point and creates inclusion. You might like guns and I don't like guns. That would be an opportunity for me to bridge with you, which is an opportunity to say, hey, so tell me more about that. What else? Go on. You know, why do you like them? And maybe it doesn't mean I have to go buy a gun, but it does give me an opportunity to better understand and bridge with you. So we have a connection around that, and that creates inclusiveness. So in a team, it's great to continue to sort of engage with others, ask, invite, and share. So teams that do this, you know, it's like, tell me about like what's happening for you in your life, invite people to be part of the Friday beer club, coffee club, what have you, and share your story with them. Because teams that do this start to create this norm of inclusion. And when people feel included, that's the first step in our model. And now they feel safe to say, okay, so now innately we move to the next step, which is I want to learn and I want to contribute. So here we are to the next step, and let me see if I can get some help from somebody else. Let's see, Anne, is it Grover? Would you
Yes.
be willing? Can you read the definition for us? Anne, are you there? Oh, come back. Can you read learner safety for us? Would you be willing to do that?
Sorry, I couldn't get my mute to work.
Oh, yeah, you got
Yeah,
it.
I was following along. Yes. Learner safety satisfies the basic human need to learn and grow. You feel safe in the learning process, asking questions, giving and receiving feedback, experimenting, and even making mistakes.
Awesome. Thank you. So this is almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Once we sort of feel included, we feel welcome, like innately we want to learn. So what happens in the learning process? And I have an example for you quick. So part of the guitar thing for me is I'm learning how to play. And I have a teacher who is tremendous about making it safe. And even though I feel awkward as an adult, like, of course, I want to feel cool and I got it and I understand. And sometimes we play in a group and I'm totally like uncomfortable. He has this innate ability to be like, it's really okay. When you make mistakes, that's when you're growing and learning. And David Rock would say, when we feel awkward, it's when our brain is creating new pathways. And so that's part of the process. But it's hard. As adults, we're not comfortable feeling like we don't know, like we're like, I'm not sure how to do this, or to ask for help. I think that can be really hard. So developing learner safety is an important thing. And if you're in that red zone, so this goes back to that flow chart, learning is an emotional thing, right? So we talked about the amygdala. So there's this emotional fight, flight, and freeze thing going on. And if you're in a state where people are comparing, right, competitive and comparing, and you're trying to learn, and you're like, if I was in that guitar class and my teacher was like, geez, Bob is way better than you, pretty soon I'd be like, you know what? I'm not doing this. I don't want to come anymore. I'm uncomfortable, because there's this comparison and competition, which truly puts me in that fight, flight, or freeze zone. And when that happens, if I'm in the red zone, the front part of my brain, again, this executive process, has kind of gone offline. And as a result of that, I'm not learning. I'm back into that preoccupied sort of loss preservation, self-avoid, that kind of thing, where I'm uncomfortable. And so we don't want that. We want people to feel safe and to be able to say, okay, it's okay. Like, it's awkward to learn, and that's part of the process. So what can we do? So the first thing is, just like the guitar teacher, try to just disconnect this fear from failure and mistakes, and recognize, if we can be present enough in our bodies to say, hey, you know what, I feel awkward. I feel uncomfortable. It's like, ooh, that's a trigger. That's an opportunity to say, I might need some help and some support. But it also lets us know that this is when we're learning. This is when our brain is starting to learn. And that's important. So one of the things we can do as leaders, if you're leaders of teams or even people within teams, let me give you an example. So I like to pick on Rob because we're friends and we know each other. But let's pretend he's the manager of this team, and I'm in a team and I want to learn something. And I raise my hand in a team meeting and I say, hey, Rob, I want to learn how to do X, Y, Z. And if he says, you know what, Karen, I actually don't know how to do that either, but we can do that together. We could learn how to do that together. Or if he says, I don't know how to do that, but Ron knows how to do that. And so maybe Ron and you can pair up and work together so that you can learn that. So the cool thing about that example is that he's modeling the way to say, guess what? I don't know either, and that's okay. And that's part of the culture of the team. And it's a supportive way of me saying, wow. And the rest of the people can see it within the team to say, it's okay to say, I don't know. So this is important. And back to my example of like people drop out of high school. people need encouragement. As adults, we are just like those kids that drop out, and we make it hard on ourselves because we don't want to look dumb. We don't want to look stupid, and we're supposed to know. And you know what? We're people and we're human, and that's part of it. And so during this, we need support from our team and this concept of the growth mindset. So I have Think Like a Scientist in here, and maybe some of you know Adam Grant. He has a book named Think Like a Scientist, which is all about you have a hypothesis and you're constantly collecting new information. And you either prove or disprove it, right? But it doesn't mean you're wrong if you disprove it. It just means you get new data and you keep growing and you keep learning. Susan DeWick has a book too about this growth mindset, which is all about, inspect and adapt, learn, try again, that kind of thing, which is really the essence of creating learner safety. So that helps build confidence, and it starts to develop courage and helps the person that's learning kind of take it on themselves and start to get into this like self-directed learning on their own. So those are some ideas. The last thing I have on here is open-ended questions. So there's this concept on this coaching spectrum of like ask and tell. And when you first start learning, you might need more telling. And I don't mean telling in a kind of a hard, direct way, but more guidance, right? And as the person starts to grow and learn and develop skills, we start to step back and start to just ask some questions, which transfers what we call critical thinking. So people start to think like, ooh, how might I do that? And what should I do? And why I say outcomes versus why can be triggering, right? When you say to somebody, well, why did you do that? I mean, it kind of depends on the tone, but what outcome were we looking for and why did you try? That can be triggering, but it depends on the person. But the point is, as you move through this spectrum of kind of more direction to less direction, people start to develop their own sense of like, I got this, critical thinking and ability to kind of do it on their own with support. So that brings us to the next step, which is contributor safety. And I need another person.
Hey, Karen,
yeah.
Can I ask a question or should I?
Yeah,
wait?
so I don't know exactly who's asking because it's hard for me to tell.
Oh, yeah, this is Carolyn.
Okay, go for it.
So the question with the learning safety, like I was wondering if you can sort of do that to yourself, like in terms of where's the place for self-sabotage? Like in terms of if you're questioning your own abilities, and is it possible then you're creating sort of your own unsafe environment? Is that possible?
Oh, sure. I think innately we have a lot of negative self-talk, if I'm following you, Carolyn.
Yeah.
And I think that's an opportunity for us to sort of interrupt that pattern and recognize when we're doing that. And provide that. I mean, if we take the model and say, hey, like step out for a second and try to provide some support for ourselves when we're doing that, because we can. It can be hard to see it in ourselves, right? Sometimes. But if I'm following you, I think that the opportunity is to recognize when we start to be really critical and take a pause and maybe interrupt that pattern by looking back at, hey, what have I done great? And I am learning. I've got this sort of, scientist mindset kind of thing. And that's part of being a human, and that's okay. Well, Carolyn, why don't I just keep you going? Can you read the definition of contributor safety for us?
Sure.
Awesome.
Contributor safety satisfies the basic human need to make a difference. You feel safe to use your skills and abilities to offer a meaningful contribution.
Awesome, thank you. So this is obvious, right? So we're moving up this spectrum on that's Tim Clark's model. So I'm included. I can be vulnerable. I'm in the blue zone. It's being rewarded. So now I have this desire to learn. And once I start to learn, now I have what we call the skill and the will, right? To actually contribute at a higher level. So this is a little bit different than some of the others. And I put on here, contributor safety is earned, not owed. And let me give you an example. So I played, now this is a long time ago, but it still makes sense. I played college basketball. And when I was a freshman, I typically didn't get in the game, but I went to all the practices. I knew how to run the plays. I did the conditioning, all of that. And by the time I got to be a sophomore and even a junior, the coach would be like, hey, it's time to get in the game. And my job, once I got in the game, I was a point guard. So to run the plays, right? To set things up, to get things going, to navigate, to facilitate winning the game, right? That was the goal ultimately. But I had to have the skill and I had to have the will and I had to earn it. And so as a freshman, I was still in the learning stage, right? And maybe even sophomore. But by the time I got to the junior, senior stage, I was at the contributor level. And it's the same at work a lot of times too, right? So what gets in the way sometimes of this? And this goes back to our model where we were talking about paternalism. And I don't know what all of you do, but like some companies I've worked with that are going through agile transformations, they're retooling job types. And so they're like a manager. Now there's product owners and there's scrum masters and there's all these other new roles. And a lot of times managers can get very triggered by this. And they used to be kind of in the middle of it all. And the people that, people checked in with and got work through, and they're not doing that anymore. Now we have a backlog and we have sprints and we have all this other stuff. It's different. And this in itself is like hard. And so then you see sometimes managers pull back and they're like, ooh, that paternalism, like I still care about you, but I really don't want you to do stuff because like I'm triggered. I'm uncomfortable with this transition and I don't know what to do. So I bring it up because it might relate to all of you just as an example. And that's when we like people, but we don't let them continue to grow and learn. So that's a problem. But how do we do this? So how do we create contributor safety? So the big thing for starters is high level, right? You've got the skill and the will, back to my basketball example. And I know what the outcome and the goal is, right? We want to win the season, right? And we want to win the game. So I sort of get it. What is my job? I have the competency now to run the plays, to bring the ball up the court, to shoot, to do what I need to do. So that's the thing. And now I'm given the opportunity to contribute. Get in the game, do your thing. Here's what's important though too about this is that we're not going to abandon me. So if I get in the game and I make a mistake, I can still be brought out of the game, and maybe I'll have to go back to practice. Maybe I'll just have a conversation with the coach or what have you to help me continue to learn. So there's this process of going back between contributing and learning and contributing again, but you're not abandoned. That support component that we talked about in the learner part is still an important part of contributing because people need that on the journey. So you can go back and forth. You have to have the skill and the will at this level, but it doesn't mean that you can't get support along the way. We're not going to abandon you. So that's the key part of this, which brings us to the fourth stage, challenger safety. So I need one more volunteer. How about?
I'll read for you.
Oh, perfect. What's your name?
My name is Shannon.
Shannon. Awesome. Thank you. Do it.
Yeah. So stage 4, challenger safety. Challenger safety satisfies the basic human need to make things better. You feel safe to speak up and challenge the status quo when you think there is a need or opportunity to improve.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so this is the pinnacle. This is the top. This is where innovation and creativity starts to happen. It can happen at the other stages too, but this is really where, when Brene Brown was talking about, I feel loved, I feel belonged, I have empathy, all of those things, and I'm learning and I'm contributing. And now I feel like I can say, hey, I see it a different way. I want the company to do great, and I've got some new ideas. So what happens here? So this is tough, right? Because as humans, if we challenge the status quo and we get shot down. So here's an example, right? If you're in a meeting and you say, hey, I have some different ideas about how to do X, Y, Z. And if somebody says, oh, Karen, you always bring up all of the negative stuff. I have a couple opportunities. I can fight, flight, or freeze. My fight would be is I could be defensive and push back. My flight would be is I'm going to have a meeting in the hall about the meeting and do that back talk. Or I can freeze, which would be is, okay, I'm not seeing one more thing for the rest of the meeting because I've been branded and labeled as negative or what have you. So this is scary, right? And we need to be able to feel safe at this level. It's the most vulnerable. So this concept of air cover is important in exchange for candor. So air cover is an important thing we'll talk about. Because if you don't have it, you can go all the way back to exclusion. I feel like I'm playing a board game, but you know, back to go without collecting 200 for Monopoly fans. So this is scary, right? A lot of times there's a lot of norms and there's a lot of bias and there's a lot of conformity in the corporate world around challenging. And challenging doesn't have to be like aggressive. Challenging can be done in a way that is supportive. So how do we do that? So let's talk about it. The first thing is this little diagram over here on the right. We want to focus on increasing intellectual friction and decreasing social friction. So what does that mean? So intellectual friction is the thing about, you know, the problem in the middle of the table, this process that we've had in place for 30 years that my boss created. And I now am like, hey, so I have a different idea about how to do that. He could get triggered, he or she could get triggered and get defensive. And that's hard, right? Because we're social and emotional and sensitive beings. But if we're focused on, hey, what's best for the organization, and we're focused on that process or that product and the thing in the middle of the table and not on the human, that helps. But it does require some ego control and capacity to accommodate people that are seeing things in a different way. So how do we make that easier? So one thing you can do, rather than in my example, like I'm always the person that brings up whatever, the way to see it differently, is you can create a process where it incorporates what I would call dissent, right? The ability to say, hey, I want to challenge the status quo. And it could be, some of you are probably familiar, loyal opposition, devil's advocate, that kind of thing. I bring up V2 Mom, which I borrowed from Salesforce.com. Vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures. And the obstacles piece is the key here, because imagine that you have this process and everybody contributes. You know, let's pretend that you're putting stickies up either on a real board or through some electronic board or whatever, where you're talking about some sort of process or some product or something, and you're like, hey, I want to challenge that, or I want to bring this up, and it's everyone's doing it, so it's not just one person, which can help. The other thing is create this concept of working agreements. So you define really what dissent and air cover looks like within your team. So you can brainstorm. There's some other tools called the stinky fish, if some of you have heard of that. But the idea is that you bring up stuff that you're like, here's what I'm afraid of. If I bring this up, that I'll get branded or labeled, or that then you'll make me do it and I don't have any bandwidth. Or there's a whole bunch of reasons, right? So put those all down on the list and say, these are the things that scare me. And then talk about how do we create air cover? How do we create the ability as a team to recognize those and support each other in the process? So I put the flow chart back on here too, because as we're thinking about this is the concept of creating a safe, sort of open, engaging environment where people are always thinking, am I safe or am I not safe? And if you define that and you bring that up as a team at the beginning of each meeting, then people feel like, hey, we'll get used to this. We don't have to be perfect. We might screw it up at first, and that's part of it. But we learn, right? Back to our scientist kind of thought process. So that brings us to the end of the 4 stages and kind of the end of my time of talking, I will just quickly say, hey, we have a class on this if you want to talk to Rob about it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But we'll stop here and then we can do Q&A together as a group. But one of the things that I'll leave you with, and I'll just read this one, is the most important thing that you can do is to model the way. Think about how can you create inclusion? How can you create learner? How can you help with contributing and challenging based on what we talked about today? Because it's your behavior that models the way. And when we don't, and when we refuse to kind of get in the middle of it all and try things, then we're part of the problem. We're part of possibly creating a zone that's red zone versus blue zone. So it's not easy, right? So we got to kind of be aware, we got to commit, and then you got to keep trying every day. This is like diet and exercise. It's not a one and done kind of thing. So yeah.
That was really good, Karen. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. So you guys can stay. We have half an hour of your time to interact with each other and to interact with Karen and ask questions. And I'm curious what you guys think. And don't be bashful.
Hey, Karen, I have a question. So as being a people leader and really knowing that, individuals bring biases into workplace and work and in those interactions, and knowing historically we've had that sense of that, subordinate kind of relationship, and some of that is implanted in people's minds. How do we help open up that conversation to encourage psychological safety because you're my boss?
Yeah. Yes, good question. So let me make sure I understand. And some of you all may have ideas too. I don't want to pretend like I know it all, because there's multiple ways to kind of look at things. But what I think I heard you say, and is it Lily? How do I say your name?
Liliana.
Liliana. Okay, thank you. We have a bias, right? If you're my supervisor and the idea is here, I respect you, right? And you can fire me, let's just say. So how is that going to be safe for me to have a different perspective possibly than you, is what I think I'm getting out of this. Am I right? Okay. Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think the important thing is it starts with that leader, the supervisor or the manager. So if you're my manager, you're right. It's going to be hard for me to feel safe to speak up. But if we start with inclusion, which is take an interest in each other as human beings, and start to develop some of that connection, rapport, that concept that Brene Brown would say is, hey, this is vulnerable and it's kind of awkward, but let's do it anyway, because that's how we start to bond and bridge, back to bonding and bridging. And then I start to feel a little safer with you. And you might encourage me to say, hey, guess what? I'd love it if you kind of give me some feedback or look for this because I'm working on this, like model the way, like we talked about in the meeting, that says, I don't know. So it's going to take some leadership to be able to say, I'll put my hat in my hand and I'll be gentle and sort of tender to incorporate being able to feel safe, I think, within that environment.
Thank you.
Do others have thoughts on that? Anybody else want to chime in on that question? Thank you for the question.
This is Lori Heinzelman. I would say from my own personal experience, like you said, we model that behavior, but also be open and honest and have that discussion. If it's you reporting to your manager, or if it's a team member who is struggling with their manager, have them broach the subject and just say it like it is. Like, I'd like us to have an environment where we have this psychological safety, or where I can feel comfortable bringing feedback and sharing my feelings with you. I'd like to talk about that. How do you feel? And don't be afraid to be the one that presents that to your manager as an open topic. I tend to be overly honest, maybe, or maybe too transparent in my dealings. But that's what I suggest usually, is you can bring the topic. You don't always have to wait for the other person to come to you, whether it's a manager or director, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, good point.
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I want to follow up to the previous comment. So let's say we do bring that up, right? We do ask that we need psychological safety. But what if the leader is not either socially intelligent or emotionally intelligent to understand and adapt or learn to, provide that? What after that is my question.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. That question comes up in every single class I teach, and every single time it's always like, if my boss is not good at this, how can I be? And I'm curious what others think before I say something. What do others think about that? If I think I'm following the question, if my leader is not psychologically sort of safe or aware, like, how can I be? Am I getting that?
I could take a stab at that. So, I mean, I think that's an opportunity for you to just be open and honest with them and say, hey, like this, like, we really need this relationship to work. I want to be open and honest with you. And so these are some things that I noticed, and they may be things that are not just affecting me, but affecting other people in our group, company, organization. And so I want to try and help you through this, because I don't want this to cause an issue with other people as well, not just me. So trying to kind of frame it as like, help me to help you, because this could be affecting a lot more people than it is maybe me.
Cool.
I will also chime in, Karen. This is Barbara. Hi, everybody. Hi, Liana. And hi, Sunny. He's out there. Hi, Rob. So I think that lately I've actually used my emotional quotient to bridge and bond without realizing it. But of course, now after the presentation, I realize that if I'm the person that has the higher emotional quotient, I'm going to use that and understand what language and what things I need to connect with the other person on, and kind of lead them down the path of where I need them to be. Because I find that if you use buzzwords, and of course I'm in the transformation space, if there's buzzwords or things that are too far away from what they're able to process, then they put up walls and they start fighting back. And so it's almost a manipulation. Sorry, that sounds like such a horrible word, but you have to figure out a way of tactfully get them on your side and build that trust to then, eventually build everything else that hopefully can come along.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I like what Steve put in the chat. It requires a lot of courage. Karen, some people might not know that you did a lot of the ALJ training with Pete, and some of the people speaking up quite a bit right now have taken the leadership workshop with either Rachel or Pete or Scott Dunn. And so much of what we're talking about fits into, and this is my bias, I'd encourage everyone to take the leadership workshop. When you become self-aware in that first day, the expert, achiever, catalyst, and how you can interact with people, and how what you say and do interacts with everybody. It impacts everybody. I think also, if I go on a tangent, as I just came out of the organizational piece yesterday, I'm looking at the competing values framework. I guess the question is, have you had more challenges with organizations when you're doing psychological safety, when they're in that compete quadrant versus, trying to get them out of it, leaders in that environment? How would you approach it if you were coaching them?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. I can ask other people too, but
sure. I mean, yeah. So for those of you, what Rob is talking about, so organizations tend to be collaborative, control, compete, or create, right? And they sort of go through this cycle. And if I'm following you, Rob, what you're saying is if I'm a competitive culture, like, so there's a win-lose kind of thing in my culture, is that harder to have psychological safety within that organization? Am I getting it?
Yeah, that, and then how do you shift them? You can do the micro shifting what Pete talks about, but I want to dive deeper.
So I think that again, my thing is all about, like, people are innately tender, sensitive beings, and we all have different ways of sort of masking that. Men do certain things, women do certain things, but under the hood, it all comes from needs. And we have needs, right? If somebody's defensive, or if somebody is judgmental, or if somebody is blaming, underneath all of that, there's a need. And so what I would say, Rob, on this compete thing is there's a culture on competitiveness to say, hey, we're a sales organization, and the way we structure everything is that I get paid more if I make more sales and you get paid less. And so the question would be is, how's that working? For me, if I was coaching that organization, I would be like, so you want to have elite superstars and you want to have people that are beaten into sort of like, hey, you're not good, right? Or would you rather have a team that's like, you know what, we can be somewhat of a collaborative organization, and maybe we can have more sales and more money and more together if we look at it differently. But back to Pete's point, it does take small incremental steps that help people start to see traction and start to see, like, how could this be better than what we were doing before? Because otherwise people will fall back into the same patterns. So in my opinion, it's a little bit think like the scientist, right? Add incremental small things that can help the competitive culture be just as competitive, but not against each other. Maybe it's in the space, in the company. People have needs, and needs have to be met. And you've got to find ways to create organizations, teams, and structures that help people feel safe to be able to do that.
Can I add a little bit to that point? Kind of led me to perfect example of the team, because at the end of the day, organization, even the same sales team, at the end of the day, I mean, you can compare it to any team that play, I don't know, your favorite football team, soccer team, basketball team. They're playing together as a team, not individual, and they succeed as a team, not individual. They have their own place to bring the team forward, instead of sales team, you, like I said, putting against each other versus putting that whole organization against, I don't know, another competing organization that's possibly trying to take over their business in some way. Wouldn't that be a more logical way to create that potential safety, but still remaining competitiveness within whole organization, instead of just individual person? It's just me instead of us.
Yeah. So I think we're saying the same thing. I think if I'm following you, you're using the analogy of a team. And if I talk about basketball, you know, we have two guards, 2 forwards, and 1 center. And our job is to win the game and be competitive against the other team, but not against each other, right? Which goes back to the competitive competing values framework that I think Rob was getting at. Same kind of thing. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And the teams that win are the teams that play together. All the ones that have like one person trying to be the superstar, those are the ones that lose the game.
That's right.
Because if you use the real life example, somebody who happens to be part of the team, you know, school or college, that will relate to people in a lot easier, versus you trying to use these hypothetical, create hypothetical scenarios that somebody might never been part of. So if you use something closer to the person who can relate to it, you might be able to break through to them.
Yeah. It's cool. Super Chickens TED Talk. What's that? I'm reading the chat.
I know, I saw that too.
So there's a TED Talk, and of course, if you Google it, Sunny actually introduced me to this TED Talk, and till this day, Sunny, at least maybe once a week, it's a fantastic TED Talk, which talks about how super chickens become so enthralled in their idea of success that they will actually, there's been experiments where chickens will kind of kill off each other, and it just horrendous things happen when they're trying to just be the sole heroes, I guess you could say,
Right.
as opposed to a collaborative group of chickens. So thank you, Sunny.
Super chickens. I'm going to check it out.
Looks like Steve has another question in there. Buried up a little bit, Karen.
Steve, you want to read it, Steve? Another question. How do you hold leaders or anyone really accountable to creating psychological safety environments without damaging their own sense of psychological safety? I think you got to tell me more. What do you mean by that?
Well, say we commit to providing this environment of psychological safety for one another. And, we agree that we're going to do this, but as agreements sometimes do, we lose our way in the midst of the other things that we're doing, and old behaviors will resurface themselves. And we kind of want to say, hey, what you're doing violates our working agreement, but at the same time, you want to be able to do that in a way that doesn't threaten the sense of psychological safety that you've managed to create and what little you've managed to maintain. I think this might be another sort of agile transformation sort of oriented question.
Yeah. Yep. I, of course, have an opinion, but I'm curious if others do. Thank you for helping explain it. Anybody else have a thought about Steve's question?
Yeah, I would like to chime in. I think listening culture at the leadership level is critical. If it is there, then you can get feedback on the psychological safety. But if it is not there, it's like pointless, right? Even talking about psychological safety, because you're not open for feedback and open for to change, basically.
Yeah. So Dolly Chugg has a book about biased and stereotypes. And she has, if you imagine a bell-shaped curve, right? The bottom half says 20%, the middle is 60, and the top is 20. And her argument on change within any company would be is the bottom 20% is willing to like get on board. And they're like, yep, psychological safety is our thing. We're going to do it. The group in the middle, that 60% is kind of like, I'm not positive, but I'm open. The group on the end, the last 20%, isn't going to do it no matter what, because they're sort of against is their kind of policy, like, I don't believe, I don't trust, I'm not doing that. And she would say, focus on the 80. And the way we are as humans is that we have a tendency to change and are willing to change if we think others are changing, which is really pretty interesting. So look around, like when people started to use phones that didn't have the little chiclet keyboard kind of thing, it was like, oh, that was weird. And then pretty soon everyone was doing it. And now we're all doing it, right? Everybody has a phone like that. And so her point is, as humans, when we start to see other people adopting and doing things, we'll do it too. And so I think there's an opportunity for psych safety at companies where you begin with the far 20% and then you model away, and then you get the other 80, the other 60. So you end up with 80%. And then there's the other 20 where you might have to say, that's not going to happen. But even back, Stephen, to your point at the beginning about, hey, we have working agreements and we sort of agreed to that, but we're getting off track. And now I kind of don't want to trigger people. That takes some courage in order for us. It's back to awareness, commitment, and every day. And this is like diet and exercise. You can get off 1 or 2 days, but if you do that every day, then you're right. Your working agreements don't have any teeth. They don't provide any guidance to the team. So you have to go back and say, hey, I think we're getting off track. And one of the tools that I've used with coaching is name it, tame it. If you can name it, you can help tame it. And when you name stuff, when you say, hey, I think this is what's happening and I need help with that, or can we talk about it? It stops our brain from making up what, here I'm going to swear, Rob, but shitty first draft, right? It's Brene Brown's shitty first draft, which is our brain is like, I'm going to make up a story about what's happening here. And when we get in the middle of that and we say, I'm going to name it, and it helps us tame it, we stop that making up the story, which brings us hopefully back to, hey, this is our working agreements, and this is, you know, what we agreed to, and let's go back and let's try that again. Thanks, Steve. It's a great question.
Karen,
Thanks.
what did you say? Name it, tame it, and what's the last part?
Shitty first draft? Which part?
No, you said like name it, tame it, and there was a third aspect you said.
Well, I think when you name stuff, when you say, hey, like in Steve's example, like it was a great example, right? We originally had these like safety working agreements. We had, what is air cover in our team? I'm kind of channeling him for a minute here. And it's like, we're getting off track. And so what I'm saying is one opportunity is to go back to that and say, let's name what's happening, which will help us tame it, because we have to have awareness, commitment, and we have to do it every day. It's like diet and exercise, or it won't work. It won't stay. And the working agreements won't have any value. We won't trust them because we're not upholding them.
Can I follow up on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know who's talking. Like
Steve, it's Steve again.
Oh
Sorry.
yeah, of course.
Probably because my camera's off, because I always turn it off for big Zoom calls. Here we go. All right, cool.
All right, there's Steve. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Okay, so in normal agile software development cycles, right, one of the things that we can do to track sprint health is we have all these metrics, right? We can look at velocity, we can measure in terms of cards, points, whatever. And so usually one of the canaries in the coal mine when we know that we're not performing the way that we should is that we see some of these metrics change, right? So we know that maybe, you know, working processes that we've set up to sort of help ourselves maintain velocity are falling apart for whatever reason, right? Maybe the wrong people go on vacation, maybe we just, you know, we're just sort of falling off a little bit, and it's usually on a scrum master or maybe a product owner at times, depending on how you're set up, to sort of pop their head up and say, hey, you know, here's what I'm seeing in the numbers. Here's what I'm seeing about our velocities. What's going on, guys? Let's have this conversation, right? Or some such. I'm speeding it up because I know we're almost out of time and I don't want to use up all the oxygen in the room. But I'm wondering, how do you measure psychological safety so that you can make the same kinds of call outs? Or can you measure it? Is maybe just a feeling thing that you have to talk through?
There are tools to measure psych safety. And Amy Edmondson has one called the Fearless Organization Scan. It's 7 questions and it's carved into 4 quadrants. And we don't have to go into depth on that, but you can, right? And so, but here's the trick on that. And I've done it with organizations, and it's a moving thing, because teams, people come and go and they change. And so you have a data point at one point in time, and then you want to do it again, and then you have a different chemistry and a different group of people. So I don't think it's easy to measure it, Steve, but I think working agreements, back to your other question, is probably, from my perspective and the way that I've done this with organizations, is to get really clear about what exactly are we talking about, and how do we have the ability to bring up things in a team, name it, tame it, right? And if it's our velocity is a problem, or, you know, whatever, I don't know, but like have that as part of the postmortem, and have that as part of a sprint review, where it's like, this is a real thing, and do it, right? And get into like, hey, how are we feeling about it? And it's not touchy-feely. This is innovation and creativity. This is teams feeling like I matter because I come to work every day and people care about me, and I'm going to get stuff done. I have a sense of pride and ownership about this sprint and these stories and that stuff. And it's like, that's important. That's super important stuff.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Karen, I want to say it's the sprint retrospective, which, if we are doing it frequently, it does bring out a sense of team psychological safety, whether they, are sharing enough, open, candid, happy, or just complaining.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect example. Build it into the process so that people start to have that culture of it's okay for me to talk about what I need and where I'm at.
Can I add a little bit more to that point? By taking a Scrum class, one thing I realized, and kind of was covered in really good matter on that aspect, actually, what we're discussing, Steve asked, I believe, is the Scrum Master needs to make himself available to each individual member of the team, because not everybody is going to be willing to speak up in the group in front of other people. And by acknowledging that it's okay to come and see me if you needed to be in person, some of those things could be actually discussed and upon later on added to retrospective eventually, because you don't want to throw something in retrospective because that person is never going to be opening up or going to give you the honest answer of looking for what you asked and during retrospective, because they're just not on board to begin with, because they don't feel safe unless you show that that person can safely come to the same Scrum Master who's supposed to act as a barrier or that additional level of safety within the team itself.
So Scrum Masters are pretty powerful. And if they can build a bond and a bridge with the individuals on their team, back to, I think, Rob's point, and Pete Behrens brings this up, like small steps to help people start to feel included and safe and part of the team helps a lot. Build
but
trust.
The only way you can do it is to actually get to know the person. Like you use one of the examples with Rob, if he knows certain things about you, your likes, your dislikes, that actually helps to build the trust, the bond that the Scrum Master needs to have it with individual team members, because we all have different personality. We have different things going on in life, and that matters. I firmly believe that matters a lot to contribute to creating the safety.
That's right. Amen, brother. I agree.
Yeah.
Karen, I have a question. Is there additional, like a book or resources that we can refer to go deeper into this topic?
Well, come to the class.
Yes.
I'll try not to sell, but what the heck, it's like, no.
We're here. Yeah, in reality, I've worked with Karen for a while. She actually came to town where Pete Behrens taught the ALJ course a few years ago. It'll be a great experience. I'm going to take it. And it's just, all the material that she'll probably present will help. But I mean, David Rock, all the people she mentioned, they all have books. It's like when you go to the bookstore, there's like a mile-long shelf of psych safety books.
I'll give you this slide deck, Rob, and you can send them to the group here. And that might be useful too, because at the beginning, I sort of gave credit to folks. But yeah, I would love to have you in the class. But even if you don't come, like, I hope you get something out of this. And you certainly, Amy Edmondson, Brene Brown, David Rock, Tim Clark, those guys are rock stars. They're amazing.
So I think the group is shrinking considerably now. So we're
so now we start to have beer. So now we're good.
Yeah, and these are the gunners who hung out.
All right, awesome, guys. Let's go. Girls, let's go. Everybody. I'm playing.
All right, I'm gonna shut the recording off so we can talk for a second. And thanks, guys.
Rob, I have a question. Sorry.
Let me stop.